Thanks, Mike. So as Mike mentioned, this is really the the evolution of a conversation that's been happening between several of us who are here in the audience and who will be speaking today and tomorrow. That we've been engaged with in small groups over the last couple of years, talking about social science and computer science and how they might work together and how things might be done differently. And this is really the first time that we've kind of stepped out of the shadows into a semi-public forum. So I'm looking forward to getting some external impact. Can I just, before I get started, how many people here regard themselves as social scientists? Okay, so we've got a good mixture of people. So this is I'm going to try to sort of set out the guts of the argument that we make in the white paper that Mike just mentioned, and hopefully we'll be able to sort of flesh that out over the next couple of days. And I want to motivate this question that I'm asking in the title with a really sort of a personal observation that I've come to refer to the bookshelf problem over the years. So I have I still read physical books. I haven't migrated to a Kindle yet. And so I have a large bookshelf at home, and I have lots and lots of social science books that I've acquired over the years. And when I read any one of these books, most of them are I mean, some of them are terrible, but many of them are very good, and they make plausible arguments. And if you just read them on their own, you would sort of come away with a point of view about the world, and in particular human behavior, that would seem very persuasive and interesting and possibly even useful. The problem is that the shelf as a whole doesn't make sense, right? That if you pick up more than one of these books, you find other points of view that are not just different from the first one that you read, but are in fact logically incompatible or empirically incompatible. They are difficult to make sense of together. So just millions and millions of people have read Freakonomics, and the basic argument of Freakonomics is incentives matter, that people do what they do because of the particular economic incentives that they face. Millions and millions of people have also read Predictably Irrational. In fact, many of the same millions of people have read both of these books, and yet Predictably Irrational says people do what they do because of things precisely other than economic incentives, right? That they do things because they have all sorts of heuristics and biases that drive their behavior. And so if you read these two books together, you probably should feel confused. You probably should think these are wildly incompatible views of human behavior, and it's possible that to some extent, each one of them is true under, more or less true under different circumstances, but neither book tries to make that argument. Each book just sort of takes a point of view and says, here's what explains human behavior, and the other book takes a different point of view and says, here's what explains human behavior, and it's just sort of left up to the reader to try to figure out how these things fit together. And I would claim that but that we have not, in fact, figured out how these things fit together, and that there is no other book on my bookshelf that takes on that task and tries to make sense of the whole. And you can go through all these different topics. If we think about performance of companies, we have many best-selling books like Good to Great that tell you how to generate high performance in your company, and then we have other books like The Halo Effect that tell you all those books are nonsense. We have books that tell us about how governments are incapable of solving intractable social problems, and that markets are great. And then we have other books that tell us that markets are incapable of solving intractable social problems. And so you can just sort of go on and on and on. And any topic that you pick in the social domain, you have a similar kind of problem, which is that it's not just that there's multiple points of view, but that they're largely talking past each other, right? And so we have this sort of proliferation of ideas, but no sort of one thing that you can, or coherent message that you can take away from them. So this is what I refer to as the bookshelf problem. And having spent, a couple of decades now reading across various literatures in social science, in the scientific literature, I think that the same problem applies to social science in the sort of more academic sense. This is not just a symptom of the trade publishing industry, not sort of taking problems seriously. And so in just one particular example, I got interested in organizational performance a couple of years ago and decided to do some reading. And it turns out that I'm not the only person who was confused. So if we go back to 1984, there's a couple of papers in the 1980s that do a sort of meta-analysis of the field of organizational performance. And these papers are really sort of a plea for help, right? They're saying, look, there are dozens, if not hundreds, of theories of what drives organizational performance, why some companies perform better than others, and yet there's no way for us to make sense of these theories. Like, there's no sense in which they are being put together. We don't have any generalizable principles that come out of these theories. We don't even have a definition of performance yet. Right? You think if there's a huge literature on organizational performance, you might at some point want to get around to saying what you mean. And it's not that people don't say what they mean, it's that they say lots of different things and they mean lots of different things, and those meanings are not easy to reconcile with one another. As a result, there's not much of a connection between the science of organizational science and the practice. So it's sort of impossible. I work at Microsoft, and a couple of years ago, we had a massive reorganization, and our new CEO, Satya Nadella, decides he's going to reorganize the company to improve performance, right? So you might think, he would go and read the literature on organizational performance to understand how he should do that. Well, so he clearly didn't do that. And I would say he probably shouldn't have done that, because he just would have spent several years reading all of these 110 distinct theories, and he would have just gotten very confused by the end of it. But you would think, naively perhaps, that the field of organization science exists precisely to help people like Satya Nadella decide how to reorganize the company, that there should be at some level, and maybe that's not, of course, that's not the only reason why we might have a science, but you'd think that there'd be some objective in organization science to address questions that come from practice. And yet, at least back in the 1980s, the authors that I was reading concluded that there really wasn't any such relationship, and they were really calling out for the field to address this problem. And so it's particularly interesting that 24 years later, there's another paper also published in Organization Science that says, we haven't made any progress on this, right? This is exactly the same situation that we're facing today, and there was a even more recent article in 2015 by Jerry Davis saying, more or less the same thing. So we have this sort of very kind of persistent problem in this one field where we just keep producing theories of things, and we sort of never get around to figuring out how these theories fit together and how collectively we can take them and use them to inform practical problems. And I would say this is probably true. It's certainly true of anything that I've spent any time trying to learn about in social science. There may be areas of social science that I don't know about where this has been totally figured out and solved, but it hasn't been solved in anything that I know anything about. Okay, so if we think about individual, theories of individual action, or models of diffusion or adoption, or collective action or cooperation, or anything to do with systemic risk in financial systems, certainly anything about government or politics, we have lots and lots of theories that just kind of sit around in parallel, and different people become engaged with different theories, but we don't ever seem to take up the task of trying to reconcile them. And I remember noticing this, back in the late 1990s when I was first sort of studying models of adoption, and I read this famous paper by Mark Granovetter called Threshold Models of Collective Action. It was published in 1978, and it's a beautiful paper, very elegant, very persuasive. And then I read another paper by Bikhchandani, Hirschleifer, and Welch, which was published in 1992, which is also about contagion and social collective behavior. And a couple of things were interesting about these two papers. One is that the introductory paragraphs invoked exactly the same set of motivating examples. So they were all, both papers are concerned with crowd behavior and riots and financial bubbles and crises and other kinds of interesting collective social phenomenon that seemed to sort of come out of nowhere. But the other thing that was interesting to me is that the models themselves were actually incompatible with each other. Like I could not, it's impossible to translate one model into the other, right? That they have logically distinct assumptions. It's not possible for both of these models to be right. Okay, it's possible that they're both wrong, but they can't both be right. It's possible that they could both be right under different domains, right? But they're actually talking about the same domain. So there's this sort of really serious problem that we have these theories that can't both be right, that claim to be talking about the same thing. And so I was surprised, not just that this was sort of still going on, but that apparently nobody else had even noticed this problem, right? That you just have people who follow Granovetter's paper and you have people who follow Bikhchandani et al., and they just talk past each other. So why is this able to persist? So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But I think, why does it matter? Well, I think, if we think that doing social science is motivated by the desire to inform social practice, make the world a better place, whatever, all the reasons that we got into doing social science in the first place, or at least that I got into doing social science in the first place, we should be troubled by this observation. So, one reason that I bring this up is that there's been a lot of excitement recently about computational social science and how we've been sort of struggling for 100 years now to get really good data on individual behavior and interactions or think networks at scale over time. Right? So this is an enormous kind of data collection problem, and social scientists have struggled with this problem for many years. And then sort of almost all of a sudden, it seems, we have all this data that is delivering almost for free exactly or approximately the type of data that we've been asking for. And in addition to that, we are also able to do experiments in a very different way than we've done in the past, and we'll be hearing some more about that in the next couple of days. At the same time, all of this digital revolution is kind of, in some ways, pushing traditional social science questions sort of into people's faces, right? It's raising interesting questions about how labor markets are organized, about what kind of information should be available about individual level behavior, about human productivity, how we solve problems, how we interact economically, how we engage in commerce. So there's sort of two things going on at the same time. One is that the world is changing in ways that make traditional social science questions kind of more salient to a larger group of people. And also that we have new capabilities and new tools that help us answer those questions. And so you might think that this problem that I've been talking about might get resolved. That maybe the problem is just that we need better data, we need better tools, and we need more computer scientists helping out, or more physicists getting interested in social science questions. And indeed, there has been a tremendous amount of activity and excitement over the last 10 years. We have, it's only a few years ago that people even started using the phrase computational social science, and now we have, now we have meetings about it. We have a big conference in June at Northwestern, International Conference for Computational Social Science, and it's only the second time that we've had this conference, and it's amazing how many people, we have hundreds and hundreds of submissions, large numbers of really top-notch invited speakers, some of them from this room. So there's really an astounding amount of interest and acceleration of interest in this topic. But when you sort of step back from the papers and all the sort of hundreds of analyses of things happening on Twitter, right? And I've contributed to this literature of things happening on Twitter, so I know about it. It's sort of, we don't really care about Twitter, right? I mean, we study Twitter because we have data about things spreading on Twitter. But, really, we would like to understand how behavior changes or how systemic risk spreads through networks of financial institutions, or how epidemics emerge and can be managed, how organizations perform. So we study certain things because they can be studied, but we're not really having an impact, I would say, on the kinds of questions that, again, we originally cared about. So I think the problem is not just that we lack data, right? That I think we do lack data, and we have historically lacked data, and so to some extent, all of this new data is indeed interesting and exciting and valuable. But I think that even if we had 10 or 100 times as much data as we have now, we still wouldn't have solved this bookshelf problem that I'm talking about, because it's really a question of orientation, that if we want to solve social problems, then we have to actually think about solving social problems. And I would say that social science is actually not about that. That, in fact, the way we are trained in social science and the way we are cultured in social science, and in fact in most sciences, I mean, I'm not saying social science is sort of egregious in any sense, it's the way things are in general, is that we are very theory-driven. That we start off in life, in grad school or even in undergrad, and you start off, you don't start off as a social scientist, you're trained as an economist or a political scientist or a sociologist or a psychologist, and you're taught about different theories of the world and how they inform different kinds of problems. And so you come out of that training and you have a theoretical view of the world, you have a theoretical framework, and very often you have a methodological framework as well that goes along with that. And you take that toolbox and you go and you apply it to problem X, problem Y, problem Z. Meanwhile, your colleague over in a different department has a different theoretical framework and a different toolbox, and they are also addressing the same problems X, Y, and Z. But the output that you produce is very often incompatible or very difficult to compare. And again, if you go and read a sociology paper about collective action and you read an economics paper about collective action, the titles look the same, but after that, it's difficult to see how these people are actually talking about the same thing, okay? And it's because they have these very different theoretical frameworks that they bring to bear. And you might think, well, that's fine. That's actually good to have a diversity of approaches to these complex problems, and I would agree with that. But it really depends on how those approaches are integrated with each other and whether or not they have any kind of useful interaction with each other. And I would say that the way we have organized ourselves is that they do not, that we publish in separate journals and these things go out into the world and they just sit there and they talk past each other. So how would we change this? And it's sort of a subtle seeming change, but I think it is fundamental that if you start just with a problem, you just wake up one day and say, I'm interested in this problem, right? I don't know whether it's called sociology, I don't know whether it's called economics, I don't know whether it's called politics, I don't know what it's called, right? I just know that it's a problem in the world, and problems in the world don't particularly respect disciplinary boundaries, they just are whatever they are. And let me bring all the tools that I know about to bear on this problem. And let's see if computer scientists know something, and let's see if physicists know something, and let's see if economists know something, let's see if psychologists know something, and everybody will know something, and they will all know different things. And then let's force these things to talk to each other until we actually understand the problem. And this is really, I think, what non-social scientists want when they come and talk to social scientists. And I remember reading a presidential address to the American Sociological Association back in the late 1940s, and the president was talking about this problem. He was saying, people come to sociologists and they say, I want help with my problem, and we tell them that their problem is much more complicated than they understood. And they are not grateful for this advice. They go away and they never come and talk to us again, right? And you might think, well, that's just because they're misinformed and they don't understand what sociology is about, and I think many sociologists feel that way. But you could also say, well, maybe we should try, right? Maybe we should try to help them in the way that engineers help people when they come and ask them for problems. And so I think this, again, I've spent several years now, almost 10 years now, in corporate research labs at Microsoft and at Yahoo, and I've worked a lot with engineers, computer scientists, and in an environment where we're not we don't have product managers coming to us and saying, solve my problem, right? We do basic science much like everybody else, but there is sort of an aura or a sort of surrounding mission that is problem oriented, that there's a sense that there are real problems out there that need to be addressed, and what do you got that can help with those problems? And so I think this is something that I've just been absorbing from hanging around engineers for a lot. But it is definitely an approach that is very familiar within the engineering community and even really within the computer science community. And so this isn't just one of many examples that you might think of. But when I'm trying to articulate what I mean by a problem, I think of problems like this. So think about driverless vehicles. No one really knows how to build a driverless vehicle, and an ordinary person doesn't think I can build a driverless vehicle. They think that sounds like a really hard problem. But I know exactly what you mean, right? I could tell you when your vehicle is successfully driving without a driver, right? So it's it's conceptually a very easy problem to understand. It's very easy to verify, right? And it's very hard to do. So this is and you might think, well, why do we want driverless vehicles? Like, driving is a solved problem, right? We have people who, people can drive cars. Why would we devote a tremendous amount of effort to doing something with a computer that we already know how to do as humans? And one answer might be that, well, okay, even if you don't care about that, it's going to generate a lot of interesting science along the way, that there is a very clear objective. In order to get to that objective, we have to solve a lot of hard technical problems in AI. And those solutions will be valuable for lots of things that you might care about. And finally, it's just cool, right? It's just there's something kind of awesome about a driverless vehicle, right? Or a robot baking a cake, right? Which is maybe the sort of dumbest thing you could ask a robot to do. But the fact that you can get a robot to bake a cake is just kind of cool, right? It makes people excited. It attracts funding. And it generates other kinds of consequences. So it has some nice features from a research perspective, which is that when you set your goal as solving a problem and you say, I don't care what you call it, I don't care what disciplines you need, I don't care where you publish your papers, right? Just solve the problem. You naturally integrate different fields. You naturally integrate different approaches because you have to, right? Because nobody can do it on their own. Or if they can do it on their own, that's fine. Great, they can do it on their own. Probably they cannot if you've chosen a non-trivial problem, in which case they have to work together. It has a nice outcome metric, right? The car either drives itself or it does not drive itself, right? It's very sort of straightforward to evaluate. And along the way, you can build a lot of, even if you don't solve the original problem, you might still build something useful. So, for example, search engines were originally supposed to organize the world's knowledge, right? This was maybe not a particularly well-formed goal, and probably it hasn't been realized. But I think we would all agree that search engines are useful, right? That maybe they didn't solve the original problem, but in attempting to solve the original problem, they solved lots of really interesting, useful problems, and we are glad that we have search engines today. So you might also be thinking, well, that's fine. Engineers can do this sort of thing, but this approach just doesn't make sense in social science. And I think that's a reasonable reaction. I mean, growing up, I would often hear people sort of utter this phrase, if we can put a man on the moon, why can't we do X, where X is some sort of difficult, intractable social problem, like ending poverty or building world peace or whatever. And it just sort of seems like putting a man on the moon is this really, really difficult thing, and helping people out of poverty is not nearly as difficult. So why can we do the first thing and we can't do the second thing? And I think we probably know the answer to that, that they're just different sorts of problems, that these engineering problems have exactly the properties that I mentioned on the previous slide, that they're very well defined. You know when you've solved them. And for many problems in society, we can't even agree really on what the problem is. And as soon as we sort of get into an argument about it, it becomes clear that everybody has all sorts of different agendas and outcome metrics. So that's certainly true. And I think that kind of puts a lot of possible problems off the table, right? I think it's also true that that there are instances where social scientists have contributed very useful, valuable insights to real problems. And a colleague of mine at NYU, when I was talking about this, said, well, what about the earned income tax credit, right? This is something that sociologists came up with, and it has demonstrably reduced poverty. And I thought, well, I don't know, is that a good example? It's kind of a good example. It's a really good thing. But it's not clear to me that the world would not have figured out the earned income tax credit without the help of sociologists, right? And I think it's certainly not clear to, it's not clear in the sense that you're not going to figure out how to build a driverless car on your own. And, this is possibly an unfair comparison. And I actually have spent a lot of time writing and thinking about how unfair it is that people think everything in social science is obvious, even when it's not. But it would be nice if we could find something that was clearly not obvious, right? That we could say, this is a problem, you agree it's a problem, you agree that you don't know how to solve it, we solved it, okay? And here's the demonstration. You might also say, well, this is really just missing the point, right? That, sociology, and actually I think many sociologists would say this is missing the point, right? That sociology is not actually ever intended to solve problems. What sociology does is provide theoretical frameworks. It provides people ways of thinking about the world that they didn't have before, and possibly even a critical way of thinking about the world that they didn't have before. And once they have that way of thinking, they then go out and they solve the problems that they had to solve in a different way. And that's useful, right? It's like a different kind of way of helping people. And I think that's actually perfectly legitimate. And I'm certainly not saying that all of social science, or even most of social science, should drop what it's doing and start trying to think like engineers. But it might be the case that some part of social science could try this. And what would it mean to take this seriously? What would we have to do? And so this is basically what we've been arguing about in these meetings that we've been having over the last couple of years. We can all think of problems like, stopping climate change or, ending poverty that we would love to be able to solve, but they just seem wildly intractable. And then, there are lots of things that we can think of which are just sort of like of the flavor of my next research paper, right, that we know we could do, but somehow seem not ambitious enough. So can we find problems that are in this Goldilocks zone of, big, ambitious problems that we can set ourselves, but where we hope that we can make some progress. And ideally, we can make some sort of progressive progress where there's more and less difficult versions of the problem, such that the easiest version is something we feel, we can probably do that in the next, if we brought together the right group of people and the right resources, we could probably make some really serious progress on that problem in the next 5 years or 10 years. And then there's sort of a much harder, more open version of that we can work on over a longer time frame. The next criteria is that it's still doing science, right? I mean, there's obviously lots and lots of entities out there in the world outside of academia that really that try to solve real problems, and that often take insights from social science. So we have lots of consulting companies and NGOs and government agencies that are really focused on real problems, and sometimes they have people with a lot of academic training, and this is not that, right? This is not just here's what I know, here's my opinion, right? This is actually trying to do science, and finally, it has to be not creepy, okay? And I think that if you, again, like if social science were to do too good a job of solving problems, then it might start to seem like social engineering, and that's something that we wouldn't want to do. So, so then I think really this just sort of sets up the rest of today and tomorrow, where well, at least I hope this sets up. I haven't really sort of coordinated too carefully with my speakers, so maybe they'll come up and talk about something else entirely. But I hope what they're going to talk about is to try to sort of flesh out this or try to address this challenge of like what are some examples of problems that might satisfy these criteria, where they're clearly important, they are clearly science problems, and they're not getting solved on their own, right? That we're not just going to if they're just going to get figured out through the existing process of social science, then it's fine. We don't have to worry about it. But they're not so sprawling and complicated that we can't imagine that with a single group of people, the right people in a single place, possibly, a place like this place, for example, which I was just reading about, was founded as an interdisciplinary research institute in chemistry. So you can imagine within a single building they made a lot of progress on some really concrete problems. Is that something that we could imagine doing in the social sciences? And along the way, we'll have to talk about other kinds of related issues, like what would we have to do about the data that is available? What problems do we need to address in terms of found data versus design data? What kind of platforms would we have to build? What kind of organization would be required to do problem-oriented social science? And I think I'm out of time, so I had some more thoughts, but I think this is as good a place as any to stop, and I'll hand over to Sinan. Thank you.
Thanks.